After the High Renaissance in Italy, there followed a period in which painting, sculpture, and architecture broke with many of the classical conventions. The term Mannerism was later adopted to describe both the period and its stylistic characteristics. The painter and biographer Giorgio Vasari, 1511–74, was the first to use the word maniera, stylishness, to praise the work of his contemporaries in the 16th century. However, as Mannerism, it became a disparaging label for later critics who dismissed work in this vein as an affected transition between the Renaissance and the Baroque. In the 20th century, the term began to be used neutrally, but with differing opinions as to exactly what style and period it defines. Origins and influences. The roots of Mannerism were in Italy. It is sometimes specifically traced to Rome and the followers of Raphael after his death in 1520. Some scholars see Mannerism as a reaction against the classical harmony of Raphael and his high Renaissance contemporaries such as Leonardo and Michelangelo, others as an evolution from elements in their work. Most definitions of the Mannerist style are in terms of either the distortion or refinement of late Renaissance ideals. Style and technique. Mannerist style can be seen as either refined and emotional, or affected, and decadent, but there are stylistic elements that can be agreed upon. It was a courtly style, but beneath the elegance and technical brilliance there is often an element of emotional disturbance. Tension and drama were achieved by the use of elongated figures and exaggerated poses, bold colors and lighting, and a dramatic distortion of scale and perspective. The conversion of St. Paul Parmigianino, the dramatic tension and movement of Parmigianino's work are characteristic of Mannerism. See 1527-30, oil on canvas, 177.5 by 128.5 centimeters, Kunsthistorisches Museum, Vienna. Mannerism. Timeline. Mannerism began to develop around the time of Raphael's death in 1520. It flourished in Florence, Rome, and other cities, including Parma. Expatriate Italians, and artists trained in Italy, helped spread Mannerism to other countries in Europe throughout the 16th century, establishing it as the house style of several courts. The period came to a close with the emergence of the Carucci brothers and Caravaggio in about 1600. 1526–28 Pontormo, The Deposition of Christ. 1534–40 Parmigianino, Madonna with the Long Neck. See 1540–50 Bronzino, An Allegory with Venus and Cupid. 1541–43 Primaticio, The Holy Family with Elizabeth and St. John the Baptist. See 1580–82 Spranger, Hercules, Deianira, and the Centaur Nessus. 1586–88 El Greco, The Burial of Count Orgas. Schools. Mannerism began and flourished in Italy, but the style was influential elsewhere in Europe. In essence, it is a sophisticated, sometimes rather inbred style, so it is not surprising that its most refined manifestations were produced for courtly settings. Italian artists were employed at several foreign courts, particularly at Fontainebleau in France, and Mannerist influence was also spread widely by engravings. Italy. Florence was the principal setting for Italian Mannerist art. Jacopo Pontormo exemplifies the style at its most emotionally intense, and Agnolo Bronzino at its most lasciviously chic. Slightly later, Giorgio Vasari shows how the style could easily degenerate into elegant but rather empty posturing. Mannerist sculpture also flourished in Florence, particularly in the work of Benvenuto Cellini, see page 177, and Giambologna, see point 179. Apart from Florence, Rome was the main home of the style, with Michelangelo, in his later work, its most potent exemplar. Some of the most remarkable Mannerist art, however, was produced outside the traditional major art centers, notably in Parma, where Parmigianino represents the style at its extreme of elongated elegance. Outside Italy, the courts at Fontainebleau in France and Prague in Bohemia were perhaps the most impressive settings for Mannerist art outside Italy. In the 1530s and 1540s, King Francis brought outstanding Italian artists, notably Fiorentino Rosso, Francesco Primaticio, and Benvenuto Cellini, to work at his favorite residence of Fontainebleau, near Paris, which he transformed from a hunting lodge into a palace. These artists created a distinctively elegant style, featuring long-limbed, small-headed figures, that formed an influential current in French art until the end of the 16th century. In Prague, the art-loving Emperor Rudolf, reigned 1576 to 1612, made his court one of Europe's most dazzling cultural centers, employing an international roster of painters and sculptors, among them Arcimboldo and Bartholomew Spranger. The most powerful and personal interpretation of Mannerism outside Italy, however, is perhaps the Tauf El Greco. See pages 182-83, a Cretan who spent most of his career in Spain. Although his work is intensely individual, his elongated figures have a stylistic kinship with those of other artists of the time. Vulcan's forged Giorgio Vasari elongated figures and contorted poses were a characteristic of much Mannerist painting and sculpture. Vasari not only adopted the style, but also chronicled the lives of Mannerist painters. 1565, oil on panel, 38x28 cm, Uffizi, Florence, Italy. Water Giuseppe Arcimboldo in his witty portraits and caricatures. Arcimboldo took Mannerist playfulness to extremes. His paintings were so popular he painted several versions to satisfy the demand. 1566, oil on canvas, 66.5 by 50.5 centimeters, Kunsthistorisches Museum, Vienna. Parmigianino. B. Parma, 1503. D. Castelmaggiore, 1540. Girolamo Francesco Mazzola is better known as Parmigianino. The little one from Parma, he was a Mannerist painter and printmaker, famous for the exquisite draftsmanship of his portraits and religious frescoes. Orphaned as a small child, Parmigianino was brought up by his uncles and showed a precocious talent for art. He painted frescoes alongside Correggio in S. Giovanni Evangelista, Parma, while still a teenager. In 1524, Hetrovaletto, Rome, where his self-portrait in a convex mirror impressed Pope Clement VII and led to important commissions. The sack of Rome in 1527 forced Parmigianino to move to Bologna. Then in 1530 he returned to Parma to work on frescoes in S. Maria della Steccata, a project that landed him in jail when he failed to complete the work. His highly original figure painting is seen at its best in his many portraits, and in the sensuous Madonna with the long neck. Lifeline. 1503, born into a family of artists in Parma. 1522, meets Correggio and works with him in S. Giovanni Evangelista, Parma. 1524, paints self-portrait in a convex mirror, which he takes with him to Rome. 1530, returns to Parma. 1534-40, works on his masterpiece, the Madonna with the long neck. 1539, imprisoned for breach of contract over paintings for S. Maria della Steccata. 1540, dies tragically young. Madonna with the long neck. Parmigianino spent 6 years working on this painting. The length and slenderness of all the limbs is exaggerated, but it is the Madonna's neck, likened to the ivory-colored column behind her, that gives the picture its expressive power. 1534-40, oil on canvas, 21 by 1632 centimeters, Uffizi, Florence, Italy. Madonna and Child with Saint John the Baptist and Saint Jerome. This representation of the sleeping Jerome vision has John the Baptist in a stylized, Mannerist pose, directing attention through his turning torso, curved arm, and hand to the Virgin and Child above. 1526-27, oil on panel, 343 by 149 centimeters, National Gallery, London, UK. Closer look. Head of the Madonna. The Virgin's modest expression and realistic hair, framed by the light blazing from her halo, are painted here in meticulous detail, in the style Parmigianino adopted for his many portraits. Her slightly elongated features presage the famous Madonna with the long neck. Giulio Romano. B. Rome, c. 1499, D. Rome, 1546. Born Giulio Pippi in Rome, Giulio trained as an assistant to Raphael. After Raphael's death, Giulio completed his frescoes in the Vatican and went on to succeed him as head of the Roman school. In addition to his undoubted skill as a painter, Romano was also an accomplished engineer and architect. He was invited to Mantua to oversee a number of projects for Federico Gonzaga, including the renovation of the city's cathedral, and the planning and construction of Federico Palace, the Church of S. Benedetto, and the Palazzo del Te. He also submitted a design for the facade of S. Petronio in Bologna, but it was not used. The Fall of the Giants, detail 7. His icon of the impressive frescoes in the Sala dei Giganti in the Palazzo del Te, depicting the gods of Olympus and the fall of the giants. 1530-32, fresco, Sala dei Giganti, Palazzo del Te, Mantua, Italy. Benvenuto Cellini. B. Florence, 1500. D. Florence, 1571. A goldsmith, sculptor, musician, and soldier, Benvenuto Cellini is as famous for his exaggerated and risque autobiography as for his exquisite craftsmanship and Mannerist sculptures. His training was initially in Florence, but various escapades took him to Siena, Bologna, Pisa, and Rome, picking up his craft along the way. In Rome, he worked mainly as metalworker, but also played the flute in the Pope's court and fought bravely in the sack of Rome. He traveled widely in Italy, and spent some years working at Fontainebleau in France, before returning to his native Florence. The last 2 decades of his life were spent under the patronage of Cosimo de' Medici, for whom he created several fine sculptures. Lifeline. C. 1515 as a teenager, runs away to Siena, then to Bologna and Pisa. 1519 moves to Rome. C. 1527 returns to Florence, where Heculius' brother's murderer, then flees to Naples. 1534 kills a rival goldsmith, but is pardoned by the Pope. 1540-45 works at Fontainebleau, France. 1545 returns to Florence to work for Cosimo de' Medici. Portrait bust of Cosimo de' Medici. Cosimo de' Medici encouraged Cellini to extend his fine metalworking skills to the art of large-scale sculpture. This portrait bust of his patron was one of his first sculptures in the round, and combines a Mannerist approach to form with a goldsmith's delicate attention to detail. 1545 bronze, height 110 centimeters, Bargello, Florence, Italy. Salt cellar of Francis I. Cellini transformed a table accessory into a valuable sculpture, so desirable that it was stolen in 2003 from the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna. It was recovered in 2006 and returned to the museum. Neptune, Roman god of the sea, the source of salt, leans in counterpoint to earth, nurturer of the pepper plant. The salt fits into a boat-shaped bowl. 1539-43, gold with enamel, 26 by 33 centimeters, Kunsthistorisches Museum, Vienna. Austria. Perseus with the head of Medusa. This statue of Perseus was an attempt to outdo Michelangelo's David and Donatello's Judith and Holofernes, and is considered Cellini's masterpiece. The intricacy of the helmet, the head of Medusa, and the reliefs on the base show his mastery of metalwork, and this statue took several years to complete. When unveiled, it was highly acclaimed, and poets wrote sonnets in praise of it. 1545-53 bronze, height 320 centimeters, Loggia dei Lanzi, Florence, Italy. Pontormo, Jacopo Carucci. B. Pontormo, 1494, D. Florence, 1557. Known simply as Pontormo, Jacopo Carucci was a key figure in the transition from Renaissance to Mannerism. His passionate and restless style shows an early break with Renaissance classicism, and explores disturbing spatial effects and distortions of scale. These interests led Pontormo to study northern prints, especially those of Durer, in order to overtake the classicism of earlier models such as Andrea del Sarto. He spent all his life in Florence, and was famous for his religious works. The altarpiece of S. Michel Vistamini marks the beginning of his mature style, and he followed it with a passion cycle and, the greatest of his achievements, the altarpiece in S. Felicita. The deposition of Christ. Pontormo creates a mood of grief and confusion by an almost neurotic use of agitated movement and abstract colors, within a complex and unstable composition. 1526-28, oil and panel, 312 by 193 centimeters, Felicita, Florence, Italy. The Holy Family with saints. Although the subjects are symmetrically arranged with the Virgin at the apex of a triangular composition, the restless figures and the compressed perspectives give no feeling of the equilibrium associated with classicism. 1518, oil and canvas, 214 by 185 centimeters S. Michele Vistamini, Florence, Italy. Bronzino. B. Florence, 1503. D. Florence, 1572. Agnolo di Cosimo, nicknamed Bronzino, was court painter to the Medici family. He produced mainly portraits and allegorical paintings in a somewhat analytical Mannerist style. Bronzino trained with Pontormo and learned much of his technique from him. Unlike his master, however, he was not at home with religious subjects, as his unemotional style was better suited to profane subjects and formal portraiture. Apart from a couple of years spent in Rome, Bronzino spent his whole life in Florence, but he was well known across Europe and highly respected, becoming an active founder member of the Accademia del Disegno, Florence. Although best known at the time for his portraits, Bronzino is today remembered also for his allegorical paintings, especially that of Venus and Cupid. Among his pupils was his own adopted son, Alessandro Allori. Lifeline. 1503 born in Florence, c. 1515 becomes pupil of Pontormo, 1546 begins working for Cosimo de' Medici, Duke of Florence, 1563 co-founds the Accademia del Disegno, 1572 dies in Florence. Eleonora of Toledo and her son, Giovanni de' Medici. Eleonora, the wife of Cosimo de' Medici, is portrayed here with their son in a dignified and aristocratic pose. c. 1544-45, oil on panel, 115 x 96 cm, Uffizi, Florence, Italy. Allegory with Venus and Cupid. As Venus and Cupid embrace, they are surrounded by the figures of folly, deceit, and jealousy, while above them time prevents oblivion, drawing a veil over the scene. The complex meaning of this allegory is still to be fully understood. c. 1540-50, oil on panel, 146 x 116 cm, National Gallery, London, UK. Closer look. Eye movement. The viewer's gaze is drawn around the figures, from the masks at Venus's feet, through her upstretched arm, to the sweep of Time's arm across the top of the painting. Hands of folly. Encouraging the lovers is the cherubic foolish pleasure, whose smiley face has a handful of rose petals he is about to throw over the couple. Giorgio Vasari. B. Arezzo, 1511, D. Florence, 1574. Better known for his biographical book, Lives of the Artists, than for his paintings and architecture, Giorgio Vasari was born in Arezzo, but worked mainly in Florence and Rome. His Mannerist style was much influenced by his friend and hero Michelangelo. Although he was a prolific and well-regarded painter in his time, producing numerous large fresco schemes in the Vatican and the Palazzo Vecchio in Florence, Vasari's painting is now considered somewhat derivative. However, his architectural designs, notably those for the Palazzo degli Uffizi in Florence and his home in Arezzo, are of much higher quality. But it is his writing on art that was most influential, not only his biographies of Italian painters, sculptors, and architects, but also his analytical study of art history. His works have been, and still are, the source books for art historians of the Renaissance period. Lifeline. 1511 born in Arezzo, Tuscany, 1527 goes to Florence to train with Andrea del Sarto and his pupils, Rosso and Pontormo. 1529 visits Rome. 1550 publishes the first edition of his Lives of the most eminent Italian architects, painters, and sculptors. 1560 begins work on design of the Palazzo degli Uffizi. 1563 co-founds the Accademia del Disegno. 1568 second expanded revision of his Lives. 1574 dies in Florence. Lorenzo de' Medici, the Magnificent. Lorenzo's dynamic posture, curving diagonally across the picture, is typical of the later Mannerist style, and is accentuated by Vasari's dramatic use of color. Oil on panel, 90 x 72 cm, Uffizi, Florence, Italy. Cosimo and his artists. One of Vasari's most ambitious projects was a series of frescoes in the Palazzo Vecchio, showing scenes from the history of Florence. They included this portrayal of the artist he knew well. 1560s, fresco, Palazzo Vecchio, Florence, Italy. Allegory of the Immaculate Conception, crowded with allegorical symbols gleaned from his discussions with cultivated men of letters. This classical composition in subdued colors derives its power from the movement of the figures in the lower half. 1541, oil on panel, 58 x 39 cm, Uffizi, Florence, Italy. Giambologna, BDUAI, 1529, D. Florence, 1608. Flemish-born Jean Boulogne, also known as Giovanni de Bologna, or simply Giambologna after his move to Italy, was second only to Michelangelo as the finest sculptor of the Mannerist period. He trained first with a Flemish sculptor, but when he traveled to Rome to study classical sculpture, he discovered the work of Michelangelo. Giambologna established his reputation with a series of marble statues, and soon enjoyed the patronage of the Medici family, becoming their official sculptor. His work is characterized by a strong sense of movement, executed with classical elegance and refinement, despite the often complex Mannerist forms. His small bronze statuettes were eagerly sought by connoisseurs of his time, and large-scale statues, especially his two innovative equestrian monuments, were not only popular, but influenced sculptors across Europe in the following 2 centuries. Lifeline, 1529, born in Douai, Flanders, now in France, c. 1550, studies in Rome for 2 years. 1553, settles in Florence, and is commissioned by Pope Pius IV to create Fountain of Neptune in Bologna. 1550s, becomes official sculptor to the court of the Medici. 1583, completes the Rape of the Sabines. 1608, dies in Florence. Edward the Confessor. Giambologna produced a number of monumental statues for ducal palaces and churches. In spite of its memorial purpose, this representation of Edward the Confessor, in a niche of the Salviati Chapel, has elements of the Mannerist poses for which he was famous. 1579-89, marble, Church of S. Marco, Florence, Italy. Fountain of Neptune. Giambologna originally intended this fountain for Florence. When commissioned for a fountain in Bologna's main square, he used the designs to create his first major sculpture. 1563-66, bronze and marble, height 335 centimeters, Piazza Maggiore, Bologna, Italy. The Rape of a Sabine, carved from a simple clock of marble. The intertwining spiral of bodies in this masterpiece has no principal viewpoint. His knowledge of classical sculpture is evident. 1582, marble, height 410 centimeters, Piazza della Signoria, Loggia dei Lanzi, Florence, Italy. Federico Barocci, B. Urbino, c. 1535, D. Urbino, 1612. Preferring to work in his native Urbino after 2 unhappy stays in Rome, Federico Barocci had a long and productive life, despite his constant complaints of ill health. In central Italy, he was the finest painter and engraver of his time. His work was an influence on Carucci and Rubens, among others, and formed a bridge between the High Renaissance and the coming Baroque period. Barocci trained with his father Ambrogio, a sculptor, and later with the Venetian Battista Franco in Urbino, developing a taste for the warm colors of Venetian painting. His prolific output was mainly of religious subjects, conventionally but sensitively handled in a Mannerist style. In later life, he experimented with spatial effects and a more contemplative mood, presaging the devotional style that emerged in the new century. Lifeline. 1548, travels to Rome to study with Taddeo Zuccaro, c. 1560, second visit to Rome, working with Federico Zuccaro. 1561, commissioned to paint frescoes in the Vatican. 1563, moves to Perugia. 1565, returns to Urbino. 1566, joins the lay order of Capuchin monks. 1612, dies in Urbino. Study for the head of Christ. Barocci was a fine draftsman, and one of the first to use colored chalks in his numerous sketches and studies. Chalk, private collection. Saint Francis, receiving the stigmata. Baroque's later works moved away from the Venetian-inspired colors of this earlier paintings. Oil on canvas, Palazzo Ducale, Urbino, Italy. Federico Zuccaro. Biese Antiangelo in Vado, near Urbino, c. 1542, di Ancona, 1609. Zuccaro was in his 20s when his brother, Taddeo, died in 1566, and he took over the work of his studio. Federico completed Taddeo's decoration of the Villa Farnese at Capirola and the Sala Regia in the Vatican. He traveled widely across Europe, working in England and Spain, returning to Rome to become founding president of the Accademia di San Luca in 1593. Together with Bronzino and Vasari, Zuccaro was the model of a court artist mingling with the most illustrious patrons of his time. Francis and Alessandro Farnese entering Paris in 1540. Zuccaro's Mannerist frescoes covered the walls of the state rooms in the Villa Farnese, and in the Sala dei Fasti Farnese, Hall of the Splendors of the Farnese family. 1557-66, fresco, Villa Farnese, Caprarola, Italy. Closer look. Key figures central to this paintings of Alessandro Farnese and the King of France, as they ride into Paris in triumph.